Thank you so very much. I'm very pleased to be here. And I spent a few moments in the chapel this morning, which is a very lovely room. One thing that Beryl didn't say in her overly generous remarks was that I spent 8 years studying to be a Catholic priest. I believe that anybody can be saved. And practicing law in Texas, of course, requires that kind of conviction and faith. It turned out I was much better at afflicting the comfortable than I ever was at comforting the afflicted. So I was really built for this job, let me just say. But my talk today is going to be 5 not so easy pieces. Many of you who are film buffs, of course, recall the wonderful 1969 film made by Bob Rafelson, starring Jack Nicholson, before he really became famous. And he plays an oil worker roughneck, but at the same time he plays the piano. And it's the incongruity of these two kinds of lives that sustains him and makes the dramatic tension of the movie. I feel the same kind of tension often as I do my own work. In large part because I do try and take the long view. To teach immigration, you really have to have that kind of approach. And so what I'd like to do today is to give you 5 sets of facts. And then I'm going to ask that we consider each of these sets of facts for their effect on 5 different constituencies in law schools. And while I never worked at a firm, I've sued a couple. So that's my experience, and that's generating work for some of you probably. And certainly they all had it coming, I say. So the same kinds of things I'm going to suggest, I think, about law schools also apply to firms because in many respects they're both large organizations that have their own folkways and their own metrics and so forth. And so then I'd be glad to answer questions should that be helpful. Within the last week, there's been a spate of new census reports that to some extent ought to cheer all of us. Last night, when I was speaking to this group of mostly undocumented college students, they were all cheerful that minorities, particularly Latinos, were growing in such large numbers. And I asked them not to go out and tell the whole world because the truth is that this scares the hell out of people. 2 out of 3 public school children in Texas today are non-white, not Anglo. And as Texas goes, I hesitate to say, because I'm mostly doing missionary work there. I actually grew up in New Mexico. When I married a woman from Texas, my father said I was entering into a mixed marriage. In California, during the 2009-2010 school year, only 28% of the students statewide are white. The numbers are clearly there, and not just in California and Texas, but Latinos, for example, are the largest group of school children in Seattle and in San Diego and in Chicago and in Hartford, Connecticut, and in Miami. This is a truly national proportion. And of course, there's long-standing migratory patterns of African Americans as well as Asians as well. But when these numbers come out, if you have the long view, you're going to think, well, eventually demography really is destiny, and we'll all come out ahead. But of course, that's not going to be the case. Well, one thing I predict that the shrinking percentage of Anglos in the population will result in is a new attention to the rights of minorities, shall we say. Shall we say. God, this is a tough crowd. I just say, if I'd used that line last night, I would have killed. The good news for legal education is that even with some recent ups and downs, that LSAT test takers who are down 20%, but they're down 20% from an all-time high, applications and the enrollments are at an all-time high. Georgetown last year received almost 20,000 applications. Dorothy, you and I probably wouldn't have gotten into Georgetown had that been the case back then. That's 1 in 7 applications, by the way, in the United States. 1 in 7 applies to Georgetown. I'm just saying. Now these trends, of course, are the leading indicators for projecting law school demographics, and virtually all of the markers suggest an increasingly auspicious environment for recruiting students to apply to and then to attend law school. And of course, down the road, that means that firms and agencies and schools will have, law schools will have much better opportunities to hire than they've historically had. Because at some level, it is a supply issue. But it's not been a supply issue for a very long period of time. It's, in my view, much more of a demand issue. There's simply more bodies, and the available birth and immigration data suggests that these bodies are going to swell the ranks of elementary and secondary schools. And as a corollary, if the high school completion and attending college rates continue, even if they don't improve, that will still mean larger number of people because the denominator will be so much larger. It's increasingly, however, a young person's game. The last data available showed that only 17.5% of all the law school applications were people who were 31 or older. And so, if we're thinking maybe they'll be going back to school because there's this counter-cyclic employment situation, I don't think that we can really rely on that. What we're talking about is the root stock of children who are already in the schools who are making their way through, I hesitate to use the word pipeline, but this river, this stream of people. There's a lot of folks out there. Moreover, we've increased the number of law schools. In fact, just this morning I was in the ADLS offices, and we have 7 new applicant schools. And those of you who follow ABA statistics know that there are at least a dozen new schools that are under consideration. And that's not even counting the Peking University Law School that has applied for ABA accreditation. So the piece of demography is very important, and I could share additional statistics. If I really want these, I'd be glad. All you have to do is Google me and drop me a note, and I'd be glad to send them to you. You will hear these in a variety of fashions over the year, particularly as the census data roll out. I think that there are some important findings here. The number of schools has increased. Of course, that means even with some schools having shrunk their enrollments to take advantage of quality opportunities for their students. If you include all the proprietary schools, there's simply more seats available. In fact, given the 2 trends of increasing number of students as well as the number of law schools, we can expect that any school that wishes to find a diverse student body can do so. The tools will be different if your school's in DC versus Montana, let us say, but there's no school that doesn't have substantial opportunities. And of course, all of us fancy ourselves more than just local schools. At the least, we are regional, in many cases national, and increasingly we will be international. What does this mean for the faculty? All you have to do is serve. How many people here have served in the last year or so on their personnel committee at law school? Anybody here? People of color, and you're not involved in law school admissions, or faculty hiring? Well, there's a problem. They can't convene a committee at the University of Houston that I don't serve on, and so I continue to serve on that particular committee. We've taken admissions away from faculty and given it to professionals. But last year there were 1,100 persons involved in the FAR process, the faculty appointment registry process. 1,100. Now it's true that never have we hired more than about 35% of our new law teachers from that process. But even so, you just do the math on that, that's a substantial number. I have a brother who has a doctorate in history. In the year he was applying to teach religious history, there were only 3 positions in the United States. religious historians, and he got that job, one of those jobs. So the faculty ranks people interested in leaving practice, going to teach, or the people leaving clerkships, wanting to go teach, or the people who are doing something else and who ease into it through adjuncting or visiting all the various pathways that are available to us. That's a substantial pool of persons. And increasingly it is heterogeneous simply because we've been better at it. We've recruited. Many schools, however, only use that means. And the general rule of thumb is, well, we already tried to hire, will leave us, so he's not available. Or we made an offer to Delgado, and so, of course, he's taken about 10 of those offers over the years at various schools. I've stayed at Houston the whole time. Or, my favorite, our job is to produce Latino students who become faculty elsewhere. So we don't, therefore, have to hire any ourselves. And so I took them at their word and I looked at every Latino who was launching at the time, and not one was from that school. A major feeder school in a state in which I live that was involved in sweat, let's say. Not that I'm going to out that school. If we look at how placement has declined over the last couple of years, I sat through an almost tear-filled session with Jim, the president of NALP, which has some real serious explaining to do on the situation with regard to hiring our students. If any of you have tried to help your own research assistants or some of your own grads find work, you know that it's very difficult these days. Every announcement of a good pro bono job or a public service job leads to literally hundreds of applications. And this placement not only is clearly an issue both in corporate and in regular law firms, as well as corporate offices, it is connected to the terrible baccalaureate job market, which of course is leading a lot of our students and artificially propping up the number of applicants. Not only students really want to go to law school, they go to law school as the regression to the mean, as the least objectionable option. And then, of course, many of them decide they aren't going to go into law jobs because the job market improves or something like that. But the real leading indicator for us is always how well the baccalaureate job market is doing. If it's doing well, we get fewer applicants. And if you juxtapose these data over the last couple of years, you'll see that whenever job markets are better, we have a decline in the number of applications. And even with the new schools, we're getting to the point where any law student applicant can get into a law school somewhere. We've been at that point for a long time. It hasn't gotten as bad as medical schools. Medical schools got down to the point where they had 1.2 applicants for every vacancy. And they aren't building new medical schools as a result. And yet, projections for doctors are not very good, but it's largely a displacement. That is, the doctors are all concentrated in areas that are very densely populated, but the rural areas still need doctors and they can't find doctors. So, as with our students, I'm always convinced that if students from the University of Houston, 80% of whom are from Texas, would only move somewhere else, they could find work. But of course, then they would be competing with your students and so forth. And there's a limited number of positions out there, and we may have reached the maximum. I'm just suggesting, though, that students haven't yet altered their behavior if we're looking more broadly. They all want to work at Steptoe. They all want to work at these really top firms, when these firms, of course, are shrinking in many instances. Or they're, because of the removal of the mandatory retirement age at some firms and practices generally, and for faculty, people are staying longer in place. And so I call that sheltering in place with at least a couple of my colleagues who continue to seek shelter on our faculty. And of course, this also has to interact with the increasing debt figures. When I was an undergraduate, I used to sell plasma because I could do it more often than I could sell blood. Because they pump the white cells back into you, and then you can sell your blood back, is really the right term. Today, many students, particularly at private institutions, but increasingly public institutions that have, in essence, privatized their schools. You can't go to UCLA and Berkeley and other private schools any longer with chump change. It's in the 30s and $40,000 to attend those schools each year now. And you just do the math and the arithmetic on this, the difficulty that 1Ls have after their first year in gaining employment, and then the limited opportunities and prospects that they have even after that, it's very clear these students will continue to take on debt. And interestingly enough, in a credit card age, they don't think of this as real money. Because in part, the money never actually goes through them. There's an electronic funds transfer, and you push a button, and you have an account, and it comes out, it appears, and it comes out, and you sign some papers to be sure, and you don't really read the terms very carefully, at least until you've taken consumer law. And by that time, as a 3L, you're in too deeply to anything otherwise. And so, our students often live well beyond their means, and I say to students all the time that if you live like a lawyer when you're a law student, you're going to live like a law student when you're a lawyer, because you're going to have to shave every day. Women, you're going to have to buy better shoes than you wear to school now, and you're going to have 5 suits a day in your closet instead of just the one interview suit. You know how you can always tell when they're not interviewing, because the men are cut and nicked because they hadn't shaved. And the women are wearing heels that defy gravity, and they're holding onto the walls like ice skaters, you know? Oh, today must be interview day. Yeah, how'd you know? Well, because you gave off the smell of fear. That's how I know. So think about these 5 pieces. Demography, which is producing more students and a different shade of student. And so the mix is changing. The number of schools, the number of seats, the number of applications are all increasing for us, for law schools. Number of applicants for faculty. The placement rates are probably never going to return to especially with more students seeking the same positions and people staying in positions longer, less likely to have mobility and open things up. And the increasing debt loads, including the inability to discharge these debts in bankruptcy, means that they're going to have these for a long time. Now, it's true they can sign up for income contingent loans. Yes, so you pay it over time. It's going to be like buying a house when you're 21. In effect, you sign a long-term note, and you pay it back. And if you do well, there's some way to forgive this, but you're going to have to do extremely well to ever get ahead of the debt levels. And of course, this means that students are less likely to take jobs that pay less, jobs that might be more contingent, jobs that require moving or that aren't going to be permanent, and so forth. Now, each of these is simply a fact beyond dispute. That is, you can Google all of these facts and find them just like I did. The question is, what do we do with them? What do we do with them relative to the concerns that we're expressing throughout this conference? Well, for schools, having more applications could mean that you simply try and drive up your LSAT scores. Schools do this. They do it routinely, and I don't judge them for that in the abstract, at least. These are the metrics that we use. The University of Houston used to have an average of 157. We're now up to 162. We used to think they were really smart students back when we had 157s. Now they're defying gravity at 162. How did we do that? Well, we shrank the school. We bleached the school a little bit. We gave it to professionals who make these decisions. It's our yield. Every school reaches its level to an extent. I mean, you can simply imagine these schools at the very high end. Yale's median is a 174. I mean, that means on a Saturday morning, one of these students missed one question. On average, in the LSAT. And of course, the LSAT, so a 174 though has not always been a 174. Because the ABA chose to start allowing school individuals to count these differently. In the old days, if you took the LSAT multiple times, you summed them up and divided by the number of times you took it. And sort of hoped they made a math error and forgot one of them. And so you could end up with an inflated score. But you had to do much better in subsequent tries because the average could in fact go down. You ran that risk. It's sort of like I tell students, is the risk you come in if you're complaining about your grade. If I regrade a paper, it could go down. You know, the laws of gravity and thermodynamics say if it goes up, it can come down. And I remind them of that, and then they back off and say, well, you know, I'm really pretty satisfied. The ABA has now said that you can report the highest of your scores. And so last year, 20% of all LSAT test takers, 20% had taken it 4 or more times. The thermodynamics of this are such that for every action there is an equal and more than opposite reaction. I know these students come here as 1Ls and they don't know come here from SIGA. You know, they show up, but let me tell you, to get here, they've navigated a lot of pathways. They've checked with others, and the high-end students in particular seem to understand this kind of stuff. It's the students who score down in the 140s or the 150s that don't understand this, and they either don't know or can't afford to take it time and time again, or they come from one of the groups that Claude Steele tells us have test anxiety, which I certainly ascribe to, a theory to which I ascribe. And so, a 174 isn't a 174, it isn't a 174. And so, to get there, schools have to make the conscious decision that they're going to either shrink their student body, or they're going to offer what in effect are tuition discounts by high scholarship. And there's a redistribution here, largely upward to the high scorers. And I just suggest to you that demographically, the high scorers come from a predictable group. And that includes most of the groups I've already mentioned. And so, in the face of what is either rent-seeking or maximizing schools to get the best mix of students that they want, it tends to mean that these are predominantly white law schools, getting increasingly so. And with almost no pushback. In fact, the ABA, which professes interest in diversity, it has a lot of markers for it, and even the ALS, which I preside over, we have values that let schools do this, because I can't imagine a world in which any voluntary group would point fingers at schools that don't do it well. And so we end up with a maximizing of resources that has demographic consequences. And I think that notwithstanding the growth in minority populations, that these are not going to translate into necessarily more minority students, because these groups tend to have higher attrition rates, they tend to have fewer college graduates, they tend to go to college less often if they graduate from high school, and they don't test as well. And someone apparently didn't tell them you could take it 11 times and do better on it the way that they told other students. So it could be a plus, it could be a minus, and every school's got to situate itself within these demographics. But of course, what is the large driving force here? It's going to be U.S. News and World, which is very unforgiving in these numbers. Some schools have even admitted students on a part-time basis and then let them switch with a big wink and a nod so they don't count. Or some schools have maximized their enrollments by virtue of accepting a lot of transfer students who again don't count. They count against someone else. And because transfer students aren't stupid, they transfer up, not down, unless they absolutely have to. That means that your better, more aggressive students are going to end up, again, if they weren't accepted in a first-tier school in the first round, they would have the opportunity to do so in the second round, when they can become transfer students. And then some can do so as transient students, as third years, moving to another school. And for many of us, these are profits that we would otherwise be leaving on the table. And I don't question it all. I think that a good school has to have a mix of a lot of these kind of enrollment management strategies. But they all have consequences. And I'm not sure there's been a good, thorough, cynical enough discussion of this. I'm here to offer my services for the cynicism part of this. For the faculty and staff, well, here's where if this other part borders on shamefulness, this is where the real shame sets in. The faculty choosing. After all, we all send people to the hiring conference, and I want to continue for you to do so. That's something that ALS provides as a service. But only in a good year, no more than a third of those folks are going to enter law teaching. Where do the other two-thirds come from? Well, they come from the more traditional, informal means. You've got an adjunct of services who expresses an interest in teaching locally. you have other recommendations, we've had people who come from this judge, and so we hire clerks or something like that. Those pathways, however, are, shall we say, less well represented than even going through the front door, in my experience at least. And, of course, the way that these things get coded on campus is really the story of tragedy in many instances. I have way too many stories that you can trace back to my own school. So catch me someday in a bar, and I will, of course, give you these pieces of data. I don't even drink, but maybe if you're drunk, you won't remember where you heard it. But all of us have the stories of the big one who got away and so forth. Often on the myth that, when I used to have the Dirty Dozen list, we would every year single out 10 schools that had no Latinos in their faculty. And one of my favorites was, well, from a school in California, shall we say, the state capital of California, but I'm not outing anybody, saying, well, you know how hard it is to get Latinos to move here. You got a helicopter over 10 million Mexicans to get into Sacramento. Like, honest to God, can you really buy this? And he said it in all apparent seriousness. Or they count people who've eaten at Mexican restaurants as Mexican, which of course helped the Mexican restaurants, but didn't help diversify the faculty. Or if we get them, they do well, they'll just move on. Of course, we just tell you that here I am after 28 years in Houston. I haven't moved on because I felt that there was still work to do there. But my point is that the fact that we've got more people coming down the river doesn't necessarily mean we're going to have more hiring unless schools behave better. Now, what is this? So we know what this might mean for faculty. What does this mean for deans? Well, deans who run schools, of course, push a string in effect. They've got to get us motivated to do the right thing, and that doesn't always come. And while deans, of course, are not without their blandishments and their importunings and so forth, and some of my best friends are deans, of course. Some of my best friends are deans, of course. God is a tough one. They don't make decisions like this. These are just structured as faculty decisions, and the dean sells the place to the faculty member who pops out of the chute after these deliberations. And so it's not at all clear to me what deans are. And deans, of course, live and die by rankings as well. Even though many deans say, well, these rankings don't mean much, but take a look at almost any website in law school this time of year, and you will see that an awful lot of deans are claiming movement. Or, this year we were listed in the 11th rank for clinical teaching, or whatever. Every school's got to find something that they're listed in, or make it up. In the Lesotho Law Review, we were the 12th outstanding con law contributor to Lesotho last year, and then hope that no one can find the volume. Of course, with virtual libraries these days, you can find almost anything. If it's truthful, you can find it. And if it's not, you can plant it somewhere in a blog, and then it'll be repeated. Did you hear? Lesotho! God. The Lesotho Studies program, etc. Now, what does this mean to the students? Well, of course, I hope no students are listening in here, and I'll deny it. But some of this turns them very cynical, because none of this has to be with them. Simply increasing the test scores only means they got to compete with more high-end schlubs than they would otherwise. They don't like that. More students means they're going to have a tougher time finding jobs. And of course, they all believe placement service only helps law review students. So Georgetown, I don't know how they do it. They got like 17 law reviews last time. Some sort. Of course, that means every student's on a law review. Every student gets helped by the placement service. I guess that's the metric on that. Students also, of course, think that we, and not without reason, that we don't pay enough attention to teaching and other kinds of things that students want. And I agree that of course, to gain tenure at most schools, you have to be an adequate teacher, but you have to be a better than average scholar. And so we have a Lake Wobegon effect for scholarship, where everybody's above average. Teaching doesn't count nearly as much, and service, of course, is added on and only required if you're the only Mexican on the faculty. Which leads to the Zen riddle: can there be a committee at Houston if Olivas hasn't done it? One good thing about my being present here, I've been able to tell them that I'm serving on 11 other committees nationally, and so I've been able to get off. So I'm on the Student Affairs Committee. I get to be on the Student Affairs Committee because there's virtually nothing to do on that committee. We used to call this Student Morale, and I declared victory and renamed it. I said, you've all got good morale, so we're going to call it the Student Affairs Committee from now on. What does this mean to our alums and to the bar? So each of the constituents, alums in the organized bar, including both corporate and law firms. Well, I meet a lot with recruiters who come through, because I'm usually trying to sell them one of my research assistants or someone, and they all say almost the same thing. I couldn't have gone to school here if it were today, because these numbers have gotten so high. I didn't have a 162 or the equivalent. These students, the median grade point is 3.7 for us. And think about that. That means that you can't really have more than just a couple of B's on your undergraduate transcript. And I agree with them. 3 years ago, we admitted people at a certain level of our index. And the next year, those people were on the wait list. 1 year, we jumped it so statistically significantly. Now, part we shrank the class and did away with a section, but even so, we haven't used our wait list in years. And so wait lists aren't really the place where you can salt some folks in the way that schools used to do as well. They prefer transfers now to do it. Of course, transfers are only self-selected. You can't sort of write the LSAC and say, tell me who wants to transfer. There's no registry for transfer students the way that there is for students. You can buy their scores and buy their names and so forth. So it's entirely self-selected for transfers, and I just don't see that as much promise. I've heard some schools, however, who told me with straight faces, and I believe they truly believe this is the way we're going to diversify our faculty, is through the transfer process, over which they have virtually no control relative to the application process, where most schools have many multiples of applicants relative to how many they're going to actually enroll, admit, and then ultimately enroll. So when I look at the places of traction with my 5 easy pieces, I have to change it to 5 not so easy pieces, and I would argue that exactly the same conversation should be occurring in law firms too. You're concerned with our progress a little bit down the river, but ultimately it doesn't go down the river unless it comes in the rivulets and the streams and the snowfall and so forth at the front end. So I'm very troubled by all of these, and of course we haven't even begun to speak of the internationalization of the professor, of the lawyers' ranks. There are 2 developments here. One is that the ABA, in my view, is likely in the near future to begin admitting foreign law schools. Now, it's true that this Beijing Law School is headed by Jeff Lehman, an American. It's entirely in English and so forth, but sure has a diverse student body, let me just say. Sure has a diverse student body, wouldn't you say? And law firms are going to be falling all over it. These kids will be able to take law school in bar exams anywhere. That's the whole point of them doing it. They don't want to do it so they can get a good thorough self-study every 7 years and be inspected by the proctologists, the ABA inspection committees. Actually, they're no longer proctologists. They're more like dermatologists this year. They just sort of look at your skin because they're, as you know, cutting back there and trying to do away with tenure, if you can believe that. That's a different rant and a different day. Let me just say, you'll be getting your AALS newsletter in the next couple of days. Look very carefully at my presidential address where I have outed the ABA on this particular issue, and you ought to be as outraged as I am. In addition to the ABA action, which would open up the borders, not a bad thing, I'm not against it whatsoever. I'm just saying it's going to have a thermonuclear effect in some respects, and you can understand how this could happen with a high-end school in many countries, especially if you are in a law school in the Northeast or the Northwest where you've got a border with Canada. And through the GATT negotiations that are going on right now, we may have this taken away from us anyway, because if at the treaty level we pass and enter into treaties that allow much more exchange with professionals so that our people or people from Steptoe can go practice in Europe, it's going to have to be reciprocated, and that means more Europeans could come here and practice. And I think that's going to happen. It happens now, you just don't know it. All the student has to do is take an LLM in the United States, an ABA approved school, and they can sit in the bar in New York. The largest bar in the country, or among the largest bar. Think about that. They don't have to take a JD here. They can take an LLM, which most schools sort of do on the cheap, and they let you sort of accumulate some hours, and you can slide through those programs, and they don't have much interaction with faculty. And those numbers are increasing because they make up for the shrinking JD body in many schools. And we're adding new ones. That is going to increase the number of people, including some very clever lawyers who speak several different languages and who may have even taken degrees in the United States. And they're going to be competing as well. And so if you think of diversity in the sense of a whole wide world out there, we have a number of pressures that don't just run in one direction. That is, in diversifying with indigenous minorities from this country. In fact, some of these, I would argue, not only push, but they wash over that small increase. After all, we have fewer Mexican-American students in law school today than we did in 1981 when I graduated from law school. Fewer, even though Mexican-Americans are 70% of this increasing Latino population that you're all hearing about. The brown hordes poised at the border coming in. And if you believe Huckabee, Pakistanis passing as Mexicans so they can come over the border. Honestly, I couldn't make this stuff up. Now, it's true that Huckabee has one redeeming feature, I have to say. He said that he would pardon Keith Richards for his traffic and failure to appear in Arkansas. And I think that he deserves applause for that. He's been out of office for 9 years, of course. He didn't find the courage of his convictions. And on his way out the door, Governor Christ from Florida pardoned that hardened criminal Jim Morrison from the Doors, who died 40 years ago for his public exposure, cleaning the record. All of us have been waiting for that, of course. So I end on this note. As long as I'm outraged, how could ABBA have been elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? The only reason I don't believe in open borders is because I'm trying to keep out the 2 remaining living members of ABBA. And then their sounds just keep coming in, raising my blood sugar, and Cat Stevens, Use of Islam, is not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, if you're looking for injustice, I would suspend all your meetings this afternoon until we get an answer to these questions, which I believe would thoroughly diversify the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Thank you all very much. I'd be glad to answer a question or two that people might have. I do have to get to an airport. So, where of course, I feel much safer because I'm going to take off my shoes and go through. Thank you, Richard Breed, for that. Any questions people might have? God, you told me it was a smart group. I apparently have cured all the evils. I so stunned you with that last piece about ABBA. You didn't know they were in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, did you? Had you known, would you have time for some frivolous activities as you're engaging in today? I think not. Thank you all very much.
Issues that we're dealing with and continue to deal with in legal education in terms of diversifying our faculty, our students, and it is a global question. And I appreciate the lightness of it because it is serious. It's something that we deal with at the ABA and of course we deal with at the ALS as well. Michael, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
By the way, consumer law advocates, it says here, trio of raspberry, lemon, and chocolate mousse. On this table it was or. Why is that? I expected all three.